Hiroshima and Nagasaki do not begin to prepare us for what would happen if nuclear weapons are used today. Most of the weapons in the US and Russian arsenal are 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. It's not going to be one bomb on one city. It's going to be many bombs on many cities. A war between the United States and Russia would probably kill 200 to 300 million people in the first afternoon. And it would cause climate disruption that would trigger essentially a brief ice age, which would trigger famine, the death in the first 2 years after that war of 3/4 of the human race, 6 billion people. The United States or Israel could find themselves essentially cornered, unable to bring this war to a successful conclusion, and unwilling to accept defeat, and make the very dangerous decision that the best way forward from their point of view is to use their nuclear arsenals.
Our next guest is a physician whose work has been awarded multiple Nobel Prizes, not for science, but for peace. Firstly, as former president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, then as a founding member of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. ICAN spearheads an international treaty signed by 95 countries, banning nuclear weapons in full. Nuclear weapons are why the war on Iran is happening, if you are to believe US President Donald Trump. Yet they remain an abstract idea in the news. We talk about nuclear programs, nuclear capacity, nuclear weapons. We do not talk about nuclear war. It's natural not to dwell on devastation beyond comprehension. But Dr. Ira Helfand says we have to know what we are talking about when we talk about nuclear weapons. Why? Because in his view, the regional war could become a nuclear war. Let's find out how. Dr. Ira Helfand, welcome to MEE Live. What is the risk of nuclear war today, and how does it compare to before the US and Israel bombed Iran?
Well, you can't put an exact number on it, but the risk is very high. And it's important to remember that we started before the war in Iran with a very high risk. Back as far as 2018, former US Secretary of Defense William Perry was saying we were closer to nuclear war than we'd been during the worst moments of the Cold War. And since then, all kinds of things have happened to increase that danger. The collapse of talks between the US and North Korea, and the rapid progression of the North Korean nuclear arsenal, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the deterioration of relations between the United States and China, the war between nuclear-armed India and Pakistan last May. But now we've added this latest situation, and it's very serious, and there's a real possibility that this could escalate to nuclear war. And we simply can't deny any longer, as we have been doing since the end of the Cold War, that nuclear war could actually happen if we don't get rid of these weapons.
Can you just walk us through that process? You said that there is a very real possibility that this war could escalate into nuclear war. What is the step-by-step process that could see this regional war become a nuclear war?
Well, I think there are a couple of scenarios, or there are several, but basically a direct extension of the war in the Middle East to the use of nuclear weapons is the first. The United States or Israel could find themselves essentially cornered, unable to bring this war to a successful conclusion, and unwilling to accept defeat, and make the very dangerous decision that the best way forward from their point of view is to use their nuclear arsenals. We've seen something of that impulse clearly from Trump, with his frequent threats to obliterate Iran. And, if he tries to obliterate Iran with conventional weapons, which is what he's been doing, and it's not working, and he can't get the Strait of Hormuz opened, and he's facing a total political and geopolitical disaster, there's a possibility he would decide that the best way to try to convince the Iranians to back down is to use nuclear weapons. And you could see potentially the same kind of thinking on the part of the Israelis. I think it's much more likely that danger would proceed from President Trump's approach to this war. And then there's also the possibility that this could just spread into a more widespread global conflict. Already we see Russia actively aiding Iran. We see countries in Asia, including China, under increasing stress from the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. And there are multiple pathways where you could imagine one or another of the other nuclear weapon states getting drawn into this expanding conflict.
I've noticed in the wake of this war a couple of headlines about countries that seemingly have nothing to do with this war reducing their restrictions for nuclear non-proliferation. For example, France or Finland. Ira, you're a lead member of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, where you and your peers received the Nobel Peace Prize for a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. This international treaty has been signed by 95 countries. The bigger brother of this bill, or the sort of watered-down bigger brother, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, has been signed by 191 nations. Are there examples of countries beyond the region stepping back from their non-proliferation obligations in the wake of this regional war?
Well, there certainly are major examples of countries outside of the region stepping back from their commitment to non-proliferation, although I think it is perhaps less related to the immediate conflict in the Middle East and more related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the failure of the United States and the United Kingdom to honor their obligations to Ukraine to defend it against foreign aggression. That failure has prompted many countries to question whether the United States is a reliable partner, whether the so-called U.S. nuclear umbrella really exists. And we see open discussion in South Korea, more private discussion in Japan, open discussion in Poland, some of the Scandinavian countries, Germany, about the possible desirability of acquiring their own nuclear weapons, or in the case of European countries, coming to some agreement with France to extend the French nuclear arsenal as a sort of umbrella over the rest of NATO if they can't trust the United States to provide protection. And this is a very dangerous situation.
Let's talk about Iran as well now. Was Iran developing a nuclear weapon? What was the consensus of that? And is it more likely or less likely to, as a result of the attacks by America and Israel?
I think there's some controversy over whether Iran was actually trying to develop a nuclear weapon. The consensus appears to be that it was not actually making progress towards doing that. But there's this very bizarre phenomenon of Iran's enriching uranium to 60%, highly enriched uranium. There is no civilian purpose for uranium enriched to that degree. And if the Iranians were not doing this in order to build a nuclear weapon, it was a very bizarre and unnecessarily provocative measure for them to take. As to their intentions at the moment, I'm certain that this war has absolutely solidified their notion that they need to have nuclear weapons. Whether they will be able to build them or not is less clear. But certainly what we've been teaching them with this war is if you don't have nuclear weapons, this is what happens to you. And it's the same lesson that has been taught by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, by the US attack on Iraq and on Libya. And it's a terrible message to be sending to countries. It's a false message, by the way. If Iran had nuclear weapons, this conflict would probably have gone nuclear and the destruction would have been even greater. But there's a very powerful draw to the argument that if I have nuclear weapons, I'll be safer. And we're reinforcing that. That is to say, the nuclear weapon states are reinforcing that. By the way, they are using their nuclear arsenals as a shield to protect them as they commit aggression against non-nuclear states.
Yeah, you point to what is a clear double standard there in how the world mandates the use of nuclear weapons or the development of nuclear weapons. Another clear example of that is, of course, Israel. While all this fallout is happening over, or supposedly over, allegations that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, Israel is, it's an open secret that Israel has nuclear weapons, and this is tolerated. What is the impact of this potential double standard in terms of the efficacy of nuclear deterrence, of nuclear peace?
Well, I think the non-nuclear states have been very clear that they are not willing to accept this situation where they honor their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and refrain from developing nuclear weapons, while the nuclear armed states, especially the permanent members of the Security Council, who have all signed the NPT, fail to honor their obligations under Article 6 of that treaty to disarm. And it's really an untenable and unsustainable position that the nuclear armed states take. It's terrible for you to have nuclear weapons, but it's great for us to have them. It makes no sense, and no one's willing to buy that. And if the nations which have nuclear weapons do not proceed to move to the elimination of those arsenals, I think it's just a matter of time before other countries say that they also are going to acquire them. After all, if these five countries, which are the most militarily powerful nations in the world, all say that it's essential for their security to have nuclear weapons, why doesn't that logic apply to everybody else?
Ira, when we talk about nuclear warfare, I think in a lot of people's minds it feels like a pretty abstract concept. We have a sort of vague collective memory of what happened in Hiroshima. We have these visuals of mushroom clouds. But what would nuclear war today actually look like?
Yeah, I think this is a big part of the problem we're dealing with because we can't really imagine what nuclear war would look like. It's that horrible. People tend to think, as you pointed out, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Last year, during the 80th anniversary, there were a lot of images of the destruction of those cities that were circulating. They're horrifying. They're very powerful warnings of what nuclear weapons can do. But what we really need to understand is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki do not begin to prepare us for what would happen if nuclear weapons are used today. Most of the weapons in the US and Russian arsenal are 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And in a major war between nuclear weapon states, it's not going to be one bomb on one city. It's going to be many bombs on many cities. A war between the United States and Russia would probably kill 200 to 300 million people in the first afternoon. And it would cause climate disruption that would trigger essentially a brief ice age, which would trigger famine. And according to a study published in the summer of 2022, the death in the first 2 years after that war of 3/4 of the human race, 6 billion people. Even a much more limited war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, could kill, 2 billion people in the first 2 years because of the climate disruption and resulting famine. And it's very hard for us to get our arms around this horrible reality. But we have to make ourselves do that. We have to understand how enormous the danger is, how immediate the danger is, because unless we do, we're not going to take the necessary steps to avoid that danger. And that necessary step is the elimination of these weapons once and for all. We cannot continue the current situation where we just hope day by day that we'll be lucky again and that this current crisis will not escalate to nuclear war.
So even if a nuclear war was a regional war between two nuclear states, the impact would not be regional. It would be, by the sounds of things, globally catastrophic.
Absolutely. And when India and Pakistan went to war last May, had that escalated to a large-scale war between the two of them, not only would millions of people, tens of millions of people, have died in South Asia if nuclear weapons were involved, but the entire world would have been affected. Up to 1/4 of the human race would have died. And of course, modern civilization as we know it would have been completely destroyed. And when people think about nuclear weapons, they don't even think about this possibility at all. That has to change.
Ira, I suppose proponents of nuclear armament would say that the only way we've managed to avoid this fate at our enemies' hands so far is by developing our own weapons or allies' nuclear weapons. That this is the era of nuclear peace or peace by deterrence. Is this true? Why hasn't nuclear war happened before?
I think the judgment of former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara is operative here. He said that nuclear war hasn't happened because, and I'm quoting him, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. This idea that nuclear weapons possess this magical power that guarantees they'll never be used is an extraordinarily dangerous myth. We know of at least 6 occasions on which we have come within minutes of nuclear war, always in the context of a false alarm, sometimes a computer glitch, sometimes a human error. And on each of these occasions, we were minutes away from the total destruction of human civilization. This is a profoundly unstable situation that we have created, and we cannot rely on it to prevent nuclear war. The only way we can guarantee that is to get rid of the weapons. If we continue to maintain these arsenals, it is not a question of if there will be a nuclear war. It's only a question of when it will happen.
Dr. Ira Helfand, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise with us here today.
Thank you, Matilda.
Thank you, Ira.